A century ago, Rossdale was a mostly bare flat with a powerhouse and a water treatment plant. A century before that, it was home of the fur trade forts Edmonton and Augustus, joined by a common central wall and surrounded by the camps of visitors and longer-term residents from many nations. 1,000 years before that, and 5,000 and 10,000 stretching backwards in time to the end of the last ice age, it has been the stage for an ongoing story of community.
Well, you had First Nations, because, well, a lot of it had to do with the fort, because a lot of people were coming from all the different tribes and nations were coming from all different directions. You know, you got the Dene and Cree from up north and Beaver and all that coming there. But then you also had Assiniboine and Stoney. And then, of course, you got the Blackfoot and the Sarcee from down south. And then, of course, Cree, and then eventually Métis. But then you also had the fur traders and them and their families.
Rossdale, like much of the North Saskatchewan River Valley, preserves a record of archaeology reaching back thousands of years. Much of what has been excavated sheds light on the stories of the fur trade, revealing traces of the communities that lived and worked together, both inside and on the flat outside of the fort's palisades. Over the course of the 1800s, an increasing number of Fort Edmonton's laborers were drawn from a resident workforce that lived outside of its walls on Rossdale and other nearby flats. In the mid-1880s, many of these workers would take treaty and come together to populate several of the reserves closest to Edmonton. Their generation was one out of potentially hundreds that may have left traces of their presence across Edmonton's River Valley flats. The artifacts brought to light through archaeological fieldwork are material links to those communities.
The prehistoric deposit that's right behind me was about 750 years old. Right on top of it was a mid-19th century fur trade camp. So sometimes you'll get different periods of occupation that correspond to each other. People would utilize similar locations over the years for very similar reasons. And of course, here we are with a modern stair, 105 Street and the Rossdale Power Plant, and the Fort Edmonton Cemetery, which is more or less contemporaneous to the mid-19th century, all stacked on top of each other.
The more we read about the site and learned about the site, the history of the site, the people that have been on the site, the more we realized that it was a really significant archaeological site, and not just in Edmonton, but in the whole province and even in the country. It's one of the centers of commerce from the early 19th century in the whole west of Canada. It was a really exciting time. People have been pretty much occupying that spot continuously. There's always been somebody living there.
I think the history of the Rossdale area is a really, really important one for Edmontonians, Albertans, Canadians, and frankly the world to understand. It is a place of very deep history and a place that has clearly been used for thousands and thousands of years. At the same time, it also tells an important history of the establishment of the city of Edmonton, because it remained an Indigenous place for a long time. First with the fort and the engagement between Indigenous peoples and European fur traders coming in. But then after the fur trade, we see it because many Métis families, for example, were squatters in Rossdale. There's sort of this history of this place, the flats, in the story of Edmonton. And then it becomes kind of reinvented as an industrial space, which then has erased a lot of that history, but it's still held in the ground. So when there started to be more attention paid to that material record, and the whole, frankly, controversy arose around the burial ground, what it really did, though, was bring into the public's attention more that this was an Indigenous place.
EPCOR wanted to do some work where their substation is, so then that's when I was approached, 2014. And somebody called me from EPCOR, and they almost fell off my chair. I'm like, wow, EPCOR is actually wanting to speak to us, speak to me. And so Chief Bruno says, we want to do a site visit with you.
Over many years, we've pulled many different types of artifacts, cultural resources from our sites, from both Rossdale and E.L. Smith. And this has ranged anywhere from pottery of those from settler times, all the way to animal remains and bone fragments, to spear points, projectile points, all the way to bison skulls and other items that might be seen as very ceremonial or spiritual to our peoples. For me, this is something that we need to also step back and make sure that we're handling these objects, these belongings with respect. The Indigenous Monitoring Program is one that we've had for a few years now. It's been probably in its full force, where we've been inviting up to 32 Indigenous nations and communities from around Treaty 6, 7, and 8. So whenever we are going to be putting a shovel in the ground in some place sensitive like Rossdale, where we know there is a burial site, there is a cemetery associated with the old Fort Edmontons there, with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people buried there, we know that we need to have monitors there. We need people letting our contractors and those who are working on those sites know that there is a connection there, whether it's familial, cultural, or spiritual, that we have to be respectful of that. And so that's why we bring monitors onto these sites to advise us and to help direct this in a respectful way.
What EPCOR is trying to do is facilitate a way that Indigenous descendants of people who frequented the site in the past are finding a new way to relate to the landscape.
Archaeology shows my footprint. It just shows who I am. When you listen to the stories from the past, when people talk about the past, they refer to it as in time their connection to nature. The land is very much part of us. The sites just speak to us being there, using it. We've always been here, and we'll continue being here.
As a member of Sucker Creek First Nation, which is located in Treaty 8 lands, we even have monitors that come all the way from those lands in the north to monitor this, because that's a connection with here in central Alberta that's really important. And our people traveled vast distances to be together, and it even shows here when we bring monitors from Horse Lake, also from Treaty 8, to the site. We're bringing that reconnection here.
Tanse Judy Belcourt and Sikasun Statumusage Ganotinya Swak Grand Prairie Gamas Tekawigan. I'm a monitor for the Horse Lake First Nation as elder. They are digging up the ground here and digging for artifacts. I'm here to observe what they're digging. As a monitor, I am just supposed to observe what is coming up from the ground, and it's been very interesting because they've been digging up buffalo bones. And yesterday they dug up a nice horn and a couple of femurs, and watched them dig and how they quartered everything. It was like, wow, watching magic is the best word I could use, because it was so interesting.
The archaeology is direct. When we touch it as archaeologists, or the monitors touch it, we're probably the next people to touch it in hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years. It's a direct connection to the past that you just don't get in any other way. It's really important that all the cultures that are descendants of people that either are buried in the cemetery or lived on the site or just even visited the site can now come back and interact with the landscape in a whole new way.
Attending on this land, there's something in my spirit and my bones that resonates of home and belonging to me. And so I'm really happy to see EPCOR is engaging with us as partners and as stewards of this land and what happens on this land. And I like the fact that they're paying attention to taking care of the type of digging that goes on here, the carefulness, the respect that we're shown in attending and monitoring the activity that goes on here.
It goes back so far. The stories go back so far, talking about people traveling through this area and trading and going back and forth. And they knew where the fords were, they knew where the low places were, they knew where to cross the river, where it was safe and where it wasn't safe. That knowledge is what made it possible for those people to come out here and establish a fur trade in the first place.